On this week's 1+1, why bringing down dictators doesn't always result in reform to Arab women. And closer to home, our own battle for gender equality. Hello and welcome to the programme. I'm Jane Hutchin. Later we'll speak to Mia Freedman and Geraldine Chin-Moody, but first, Manal Omar is a Palestinian American who's worked for humanitarian organisations throughout the Middle East. It was her posting to Iraq to establish an office for Women International in 2003 that still plays on her mind as she contemplates the role Arab women have played in the recent revolts across the region. She wrote Barefoot in Baghdad about her time in Iraq, and she's currently Director of Iraq Programs at the US Institute of Peace in Washington. Manal Omar, welcome to 1+1. How do you see events playing out in the Middle East at the moment in terms of women's rights?
Well, the events in the Middle East are extremely exciting. I feel like the last 15 years working in the region have kind of culminated to this point where you're seeing people on the streets really holding their own communities, their own governments accountable. And it's great to see that women are at the forefront. Of course, the challenge is to make sure that once decisions are being made, particularly looking into Egypt with constitutional reform, that women are also at the table and that they're also making sure that their rights are being enshrined in whatever new system is evolving.
Now, in the months after the US-led invasion in Iraq, Iraqi women reformers and NGOs were extremely optimistic about advancing the cause of women. What happened after that?
Yeah, early on, as you said, people were really optimistic. There was talks about how Iraq would leap forward. As you know, Iraqi women have a very strong history and have always been leading the region in terms of women's rights. So 2003, the sky was the limit. Unfortunately, that's not exactly what happened. There was a lot of new influences that was entering Iraq, a lot of struggle, and by 2004, it became clear that women would just need to be fighting to maintain the status quo, the rights they already had guaranteed for them. And it's been pretty much, downhill from there in terms of a real struggle for Iraqi women to protect their rights, to fight off regional influences, outside influences. And today, in 2011, there is a fear that Iraq would actually backslide rather than improve.
Do you blame US and coalition forces for allowing that backslide to happen?
I think that there's a lot of people that are responsible. Among them was the international intervention, not paying enough attention to securing women's rights, as I mentioned early on when you're doing constitutional reform. But also the regional influence is something not to underplay. A lot of people were playing games within Iraq, kind of promoting their own agendas, and unfortunately what got lost in between were the women's issues. So there's a lot of people who are responsible. I think what's good and why I'm cautiously optimistic about Iraq is seeing how women continue to take a forefront in demanding their rights and not allowing themselves to be sidelined or marginalized.
You say that to some extent your time in Iraq still haunts you. How so?
Well, along the way, working in Iraq, I had some wonderful experiences, but also experienced great loss. People very close to me paid, the ultimate price, paid their life for promoting women's rights. And I think that there is a little bit of the survivor's guilt that still haunts me, a little bit of the questioning. Again, after 7 years really involved in Iraq, what was the impact? What were we able to accomplish? Particularly, as I mentioned, Iraqi women are still struggling to secure their rights. And, you have the moments of self-doubt. Was it worth it? Was I, able to help in any way? And those questions tend to really bring in a dark cloud over a lot of the work that I've done.
Are you able to say how they did pay a price? What are you talking about there?
Well, with their lives. A lot of people were killed in Iraq. And I, particularly think of a good friend of mine, Fern Holland, who came from Ohio and worked very hard for women's rights. You have Marla Rezeki, a journalist who really fought to protect civilians' rights. And you have countless, an incredible large amount of Iraqi women who were assassinated at their doorstep, sometimes even in front of their own children, who were speaking out on their issues and, refusing to be silent. And these are people I worked very closely with. And to see, that they, in the end, were killed for the same type of work that I did, really left a feeling of loss and a question of having to really continue the work that they began.
So is it safer now than it was under Saddam?
That's the trick question, and it's a really hard question to answer. I mean, the reality is, of course, it's not safer. The type of instability that's going out throughout the country, even, this week alone, you have protests. People are calling the protests the day of rage, similar to what's happening in the Middle East. A lot of people calling it the day of regret, in terms of voting, in terms of the elections, in terms of the outcome of the government, in terms of, 2003. There is, a lot of difficulty in identifying Iraq as better or worse. However, when you ask Iraqis very bluntly, what would they like Saddam back? The answer is almost always no. People don't want to have that type of Ba'athist regime, to have Saddam back. But the struggle, and I think it's a struggle in the region as a whole, is why is that our choices? Either dictatorship or chaos. And Iraqis are really looking for that middle ground.
At the moment, a lot of people are in that euphoric state, for example, in Egypt, as they think of a future without Hosni Mubarak. But do you think the same pessimism will eventually creep in a sense, as it has done in countries like Iraq?
It's really hard to say. The jury's still out in terms of where it could go. Egypt is a very different country than Iraq, obviously. And Iraq, Saddam Hussein was a madman, but a genius in terms of cutting Iraqis off. So you had no satellite television, you had no internet, you had no contact with the outside world, and Saddam pretty much eliminated all forms of civil society. Whereas Egypt, you have, even under Mubarak, a very vibrant civil society, high academics, a link with the elite young people who were part of the movement with the grassroots, which again, you rarely find that type of connection, which resulted in Tahrir Square. And what was very brilliant was it was an organized, non-violent movement that came from within. So that gives me, and I always use the word cautious optimism that Egypt could potentially come out a different model. Egyptians are very well aware of the challenges in front of them. And I remember the first days of, Mubarak stepping down, every worry swept in, because I know the difficulties of constitutional reform or even potentially drafting a new constitution. And I told myself, take a step back and enjoy the moment, because it's truly a remarkable moment that's happening in the Middle East.
You're Palestinian, and your family came to the US as Palestinians. What year was that? Can you just remind me first of all?
It was 1975.
1975. How does the experience of your parents, for example, how does that inform what you do?
Well, and obviously being Palestinian, I was always aware of social injustices. I think also I was very fortunate that my parents raised me, understanding that I was just as American as I was Palestinian, and that I was, a Southerner, and I was also a Muslim woman. And, all these different identities that should have contradicted, my parents kept telling me this is part of who you are, and to accept and embrace each part of my identity. And I, grew up with kind of believing that that's the case, and that's what everyone does, and everyone has a multiple identity, and it's not schizophrenic, it's actually powerful. And I felt that was something that really tied into who I became and into my career choices. And part of that was feeling the need. Obviously being in America, I was part of a privileged group. I, had access to education. I had access to healthcare. And I was taught never to take that for advantage, that most of the world does not have that access. So growing up, I knew I wanted to do something where I could give back to my community and to my region.
How do you respond to feminists both in the US and here in Australia who see the veil as a symbol of subjugation?
It's a difficult conversation to have, and I unfortunately have it a lot of times. Many times.
Have you had it here?
I haven't had it here yet, but it's my first day in Australia, so it'll be interesting seeing how the next few days pan out. But I have it often in the UK and in America, and many people will very bluntly say that the veil represents patriarchy, and that some people have even gone as far as calling me a hypocrite to talk about women's issues, but then promote patriarchy by the way I dress. And it's a fascinating conversation for me, because the whole element of choice and stripping women of that ability to make that choice, is such an obvious missing gap that, it strikes me as odd when feminists miss that, because it's important that nobody, particularly any man, tell a woman how to dress, whether it's more or less. And I would like to see a global sisterhood where women are standing together saying nobody's going to tell us how to dress, and no one's going to judge us for the decisions that we make. And, seeing a woman wearing a burqa next to a woman next to a bikini, both delivering the same message, is the type of thing I would like to see from women and from feminists in the future.
So you think it's narrow-minded people making that assumption?
I do. I think that it's a lack of complete awareness. I wore the scarf from complete choice, and when I was veiled, my mother, who comes from a very strong, she would never use the word feminist and would probably kill anyone who would use the word feminist, but she didn't talk to me for 6 months because she felt that I was closing the door of opportunity when I covered. After the 6 months, and she saw that I continued, I was on the basketball team in my community in America, and I continued to swim, and I continued to be active and continued to speak my mind. She recognized that the veil was just a piece of material. I mean, it's just a clothing material, and so much judgment, so much debate is going around it that it's a little disappointing that we're allowing the discussion to center again around something physical rather than around something intellectual.
Speaking of clothing, you were once criticized, I believe it was in the United Kingdom, for wearing an Islamic form of swimsuit. I think it was even dubbed a bikini.
Yeah.
Is that a one-off offence, or have you had that response everywhere you've gone, wearing a bikini?
Well, fortunately, most people have been pretty accepting of my Islamic swimsuit, primarily because, it's just a wetsuit. So, people who are familiar with, and I was saying probably in Australia, it wouldn't be seen as a big deal because people have a surfing culture. But when I was in Oxford, someone took offense to it. And it wasn't so much just the idea of what I was wearing to swim. It was the debate that emerged after that. And I remember someone posted, today they're swimming in our public pools, tomorrow they're going to blow up our churches and build mosques. And I thought to myself, that's a bit extreme. I'm literally just going to take a dip in the pool, and this is the conclusion that people are drawing. I've been working all about women's rights, and yet you have, within, just viewing me, made all this judgment about me, and trying to break those walls because, avoiding the difficult conversations, the difficult discussions, I think is one of the biggest challenges for Western communities to understand their immigrant population.
Manal Omar, it's been a pleasure speaking with you.
Thank you. Thank you for hosting me.
Mia Freedman writes the popular blog Mamma Mia and a newspaper column. She's the former editor of Cosmopolitan, Clio and Dolly magazines. She also spent a year at Channel 9, but laboured, she says, with its blokey executive culture. She now chairs the federal government's National Advisory Committee on Body Image. Mia Freedman's latest book is Mea Culpa, and she's speaking with Monica Attard.
Mia Freedman, welcome to 1+1.
Thank you.
Now, a mother of 3, not to mention various animals in the household from what I read, you run a highly successful online venture, which actually makes money these days. How hard do you find it to be a mother of 3 and a businesswoman?
Very, very. I have a lot of help, and I think it's always really important to say that. I have a nanny that comes 4 days a week. I have a cleaner. We now have staff in our business. And I still struggle. I still cut a lot of